Hi, everyone, and welcome to the week ahead. I'm Tony Nash. Today, we're focused on China, and we're joined by some key experts on China. I have to tell you, when I moved back to the US in 2017, I was shocked at how few credible people could speak about China. And today, we've really got the best possible. We've got Shehzad Qazi from China Beige Book. We've got Mary Kissel from Stevens. And we've got Isaac Stonefish from Strategy Risks. It's a critically important time for China as they try to get their economic liftoff from domestic stimulus and contend with their place in the world. As we look at the conflict in the Middle East, Russia and Iran have both lost status amid that turmoil, key allies for China. And as China girds itself for a newly assertive Trump administration coming in. So, Shehzad, Mary, Isaac, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to go through a few key topics today. First is, how strong is China's domestic economy really? Shehzad and China Beige Book monitor that with a lot of key statistics, their own work, and I really can't wait to dig into that with him. We're looking at China's place in the world and I want to understand kind of where are they really? I mean, we see them as one of the leading nations, but really where are they and where do we expect them to go? We look at China standing with a newly economically competitive US. Now, will that really be newly economic competitive US stance? We'll take a look at that. And then we want to look a little bit micro in China as a risk for US companies. And Isaac's got some amazing information on that would like to come through. So guys, thank you so much. I'm excited about this. It's taken almost 2 months to get this together. So I'm really, really excited about this. So, Shehzad, let's start digging into China's economy and how China's actually doing. The world is not short of China opinions. You guys have amazing perspectives at CBB. Like you guys, I didn't think the Chinese stimulus would really have a major impact. It's had a bit of an impact, but we really haven't seen it take off like many people had hoped. We saw a quick bump in Chinese equities after the stimulus was announced, but about half of that, I think, has been given back. So markets aren't really convinced that this is the turn. And this week you posted about economic indicators showing mixed results for China's economy and for the impacts of stimulus. So could you walk us through that and help us understand the wider context domestically within China, and also some specific things that you're keeping an eye on?
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is great. Let's maybe pull back because there have been so many competing narratives on the health of the Chinese economy. The point that's, I think, key to understand here is that the Chinese economy is not in a crisis. And because it's not in a crisis, you haven't, by the way, gotten the type of big bang stimulus that a lot of China watchers have been predicting was now inevitable in 2024. Of course, you get calls about stimulus for China almost every year. Certainly since COVID, we've been seeing this pretty regularly, and they've been wrong every time. What happened this year is that the economy actually started out on a pretty strong footing in the first quarter. The economy was looking fairly healthy. Since then, as we had suspected would be the case, you saw it lose, pace. So there was certain amounts of, it was still growing year over year. It was just growing at a less rapid pace, right? So that kind of slowdown or deceleration started creating this view among a lot of market watchers and China watchers that, oh no, the economy is in trouble. And of course, you got a lot of bad news in the property market into the first half of the year, for sure, a little bit more. And that only underscored, this idea that the economy was actually quickly spiraling into a crisis and that the Communist Party had no option, they finally will have to absolutely step in, throw a bunch of money at this to rescue the economy and to get to the roughly 5% growth target for the year. But as I said, that was never really the case. I mean, even into the summer, you saw pockets of strength in consumer spending, and finally, you're starting to see actually some amounts of really, really low levels of stabilization, but certainly some levels of stabilization and some positive news even out of the property market. So again, pulling back, slower pace of expansion is one thing, but a catastrophe or a crisis they need to solve is completely different. Which is why we were completely opposed to this idea that China was now upon its Draghi moment. It's a pull out the stops type of thing that's going to happen. It never did. The stimulus that was announced was big chunks of it were really about recycling bad debt. We got some more measures on the housing market. But again, you don't have Beijing trying to get in and do a massive rescue there because they're very concerned about the idea of eventually reflating the housing market, right? So it's incremental, and they are watching what the effects are of their prior stimulus measures that they've put in, small amounts of, and the prior rescue measures that they've put in, and they want to see what the impact is, and then they're moving forward on that basis. So that's the health of the Chinese economy today. And I think looking into 2025, of course, with tariffs lingering, and with potentially continued improvement in the property market, the nature of stimulus will change. We can talk about that in a second.
Okay, great. So when you talk about pockets of stabilization, can you walk us through what some of those key pockets are that you're seeing?
Yeah. If you looked at consumer spending, for example, it's not been all bad news, as I said. In the summer, for example, you saw travel, you saw hospitality, chain restaurants, and that kind of thing. The dining out component, you saw people spending money there. And when they were pulling back from experiences, kind of like the way we saw here in the United States in the aftermath of COVID, you saw them, spending more on goods. There's this trade-off that has taken place. What you don't have, of course, is people spending money across the board, right? That's not happening. But you certainly don't have consumers that have just wholesale pullback. If you look at the housing market, we, for the last couple of months, have been seeing some positive signs there. Just the most recent data that we had put out in November, we actually saw sales, year-over-year sales, look better both in our home builder survey as well as our realtor survey on the residential side. So year-over-year sales looking better. If you look at the pricing index for the home builder component, even the pricing index looked better. So again, we're not talking about a booming housing market by any stretch of the imagination. Right. But I think a lot of that bleeding, maybe we're finally seeing it stop. I think we probably are somewhere around a cyclical bottom in the housing market, where we're getting close to that. So those are some of the more positive strands that I would pull on.
Okay. I remember in 2009, I was in Shanghai and I was sitting with one of the Chinese national writers for the Wall Street Journal, and we were having a coffee, and he said, look around you. He said, the whole world is saying that China is a mess, but do you see that? Looking around this, the city, do you see that? And it was a really interesting kind of local versus international perspective on things. Of course, we were sitting in a pretty wealthy part of Shanghai at the time, but it was a great question, and what you see on the ground versus what you see from kind of international media. I guess one of my key worries for China right now is the evergreening of debt that they've been doing since 2008, right? Debt accumulates, it's evergreen. Debt accumulates, it's evergreen. It goes on and on and on. And so what I wonder, Shehzad, is, we hear about China being this creditor country, right? They net lend supposedly to other parts of the world, but they can't even pay off their own debt. They can't. So how is China really a creditor country? Honestly, that's something that I'm kind of tossing around my head and really wondering if they're a creditor country. Of course, they buy debt from other countries, but are they really a creditor country? And second, how long can they evergreen that debt? Because they've been doing it since 2008, 9. How long can they evergreen that before they actually pay it off. And Mary, Isaac, after we hear from Shehzad, I want to hear your perspective on this as well.
Yeah, so let me make it really, really quick here, and perhaps I'll take it in a slightly different direction because when we think about Chinese debt, one of the more common refrains that you get out it's certainly again since 2020, we've seen this happen a few times, is this idea that China is perhaps on the cusp of a Lehman moment, right? That you're going to have a whole bunch of debt go bad, and you're going to have institutional and failure across the board, which is going to create this massive financial crisis. But we haven't seen that happen. Actually, what we've seen happen on the other end is the ability of the center to consistently get in there and take care of the bad debt problem, right? So yes, there's a lot of recycling that takes place there. The real risk, I think, is that it is what probably is slowing down the Chinese economy. It is what is the reason why China is going to continue to grow below 5% because they have to dedicate so much of their resources towards just taking care of bad debt that
Just
has an impact on
maintenance, right?
overall growth,
Just
right?
maintenance. They're not paying it off. They're just maintaining it.
Yeah, right. So I think those are some of the downsides, for China on there. But maybe I'll stop there.
Okay. It's interesting you bring up the Lehman moment. I'll go to Isaac and Mary in a second, but it's interesting you bring up a Lehman moment. I hear people say that about China, but you can't have a Lehman moment if markets don't clear. So China necessarily has to have an economically driven political moment, right? You don't really have a Lehman moment there because absolutely everything is controlled. So,
Yeah.
Isaac, tell me what you think about, China debt, China economy. What are you seeing? What are your companies telling you? How are they feeling?
Thank you, Tony. Great to be here. Always wonderful listening to Shehzad talk on the Chinese economy. I always learn something when he does. On the question of debt, the radical difference between China's economy and the US economy is not the amount of data that we have on China's economy, but the quality of data. The data is very poor, and gauging sentiment is so much harder. And so many of these questions we're talking about really come down to the level of trust in China's economy, both domestically and internationally. And because the information quality is so much poor, it's a much harder thing to gauge. And so I think the very unsatisfying answer to any question about China's debt crisis is there a perception, domestic or internationally, that it's a crisis? And is there a run on the banks? Is there a draw? Do creditors want to be repaid or do they not? And when they are doing so, are other people knowing about them, or is that information not getting shared and so it doesn't become contagious? In terms of what the companies that Strategy Risks works with are telling us about this, I think there's a broad focus, almost a laser focus on the question of tariffs, because that to them is the easiest variable to see. And it is a very clear one. And it's a very clear, okay, this is the price differential. And what I to constantly remind people is that tariffs, and very curious to hear Mary's thought on this, but tariffs are almost certainly coming, and they're almost certainly coming at a high level, but they will be enforced unevenly, and there will be a lot of waivers for certain companies and certain sectors. And so the goal for big global companies is to show how they are not dependent on China and how they are advancing American interests. This is especially true for Japanese and South Korean and Middle Eastern companies in the States, is to position themselves as, yes, I do some business with China, but I'm reducing that business and I'm not working directly with the People's Liberation Army. I'm not importing directly from Xinjiang or even indirectly. And therefore, I should have a tariff waiver.
Isaac, that's very interesting. So we've had this concept particularly in tech for 20, 30 years almost, that China is its own ecosystem. When you look at software, when you look at internet companies, that sort of thing, China really is its own ecosystem. Are we likely to move along that path for manufactured goods? For example, like GM and Volkswagen, they kind of have this China ecosystem that doesn't really bleed over into other areas. Are companies more likely to do that? Like, do you think that's the path we're headed down, where they have a China, Southeast Asia, East Asia ecosystem? They have a North. I know that's an old regionalization discussion, but I'm just curious, are we going to see that in the physical world, not just the software world?
It's a great question. We hear a lot of people talking about a China for China strategy. We saw that with Uniqlo recently. We see that with a lot of other companies that talk about it
Starbucks
publicly.
now.
Yeah, exactly. Yum China did it very early. I do think there's going to be more of that. I think in some cases it's a big mistake for companies because they seem to think that they're waiting out the tensions as opposed to thinking through, oh gosh, if I do that and then China invades Taiwan or there's a massive dislocation, what happens to all my assets in China? There's such a problem with repatriating capital today. And I think the company assumption that we see sometimes is that that's going to get better in a period of 5 to 10 years, but our prediction is that it's going to get much worse.
Yep. Mary, help us understand all of this. There's a lot going on here. You are covered in angelic light right now, so
I know. I was just noticing that. I just want to assure everybody that I am human and I haven't descended down here. If I'm not sure what's going on with the lighting, sorry about that, gentlemen. But Tony, thanks for having me on again. It's just such a treat to be on such a distinguished panel. There are a lot of threads to pull on here, but let me see if I can extract a few themes that I find interesting. But before I do that, I should also say that Stevens is a family-owned investment bank. I think we're the largest in the United States, and a rare financial institution that never bet on mainland China because our owners thought no rule of law, no property rights. Why in the world would you go in there? So just thought I would lay that out so you know our point of view. I think one of the interesting themes that's come out from both of my co-panelists' comments is just the opacity of the regime. I mean, the China Beige Book does extraordinary work because they've deployed an army of people across the country to collect all manner of data that is not provided by the Chinese Communist Party. And that's why they're so sought after, because I think they have a lens that many don't have. Same with Isaac and strategy risks. And so it's almost impossible to say what is the local debt burden, where might the next eruption be? How bad is the property crisis? But so that's just the first foundational point. The second point, to Shehzad and Isaac's comments about debt and debt servicing. Well, my goodness, if you have restrictive capital controls and you limit the ability of your citizens to take capital offshore, sure, you can roll over a lot of debt for a very long time because it's state controlled and you're seizing capital. You're also limiting the ability of your citizens to deploy that capital even internally in the country. You can't invest in many asset classes. I think that's an important part of the framework to understand what's going on. Thirdly, again, to the comments about the quality of the growth. Well, yes, it's true. China may not be in a crisis that we can perceive today. However, that's very different from saying, golly, if the political system were Taiwan's, where you had a free and open democracy, what could they be growing at? And I find that that's a point of view that almost never gets voiced. We're always talking about this artificial target that a couple of party officials lay out instead of asking, my goodness, how much is the party holding China back? And I think to understand that, you just look across the Taiwan Strait and you see how Taiwan is growing, and even they have terrible economic policies, but at least there's some sort of give and take there, and oversight and independent boards and all the other things that make us grow. So that's the third theme I'd maybe pull on, and maybe I'll just add a fourth one, Tony, which is you started the conversation by mentioning that the party may be girding for a more aggressive administration in terms of the second term of President Trump. I served in the first term, I should say that, and I was very involved in China policy from the State Department side with Secretary Pompeo. And I think that framing is in some respect misleading because I don't think that you have had another president who was so willing to engage with Xi Jinping, with other nations, trying to construct a fair and reciprocal trade regime. Everything that the United States did was really in reaction to the behavior of Beijing. Just look at, for instance, just to use a current example, I mean, how can you trust a counterparty that has just mounted the largest cyber intrusion in our history. I mean, Chinese can listen to any call, read any text. We have no indication of their intent. Could they shut our whole system down? We don't know.
Yep.
So we're supposed to come to the negotiating table and, play nice and remove tariffs. Are you kidding? That's a joke.
Well,
So
Mary, I thought all this cyber
lot,
stuff
lot
was,
of themes there, but maybe I'll just end there.
yeah, I thought these are all great comments. I thought all the cyber stuff was solved when Obama sat down with Xi Jinping in 2015 and they came to the cyber agreement, right? I mean, for some reason that didn't solve it. And your point about the Trump's first administration and second administration that is often lost in media narrative is that it's reciprocation of the way China already treats the US. It's
Right.
very simple. We've had very passive administrations in the US who just accepted that treatment. And then we get an administration that's considered aggressive simply for doing to China what they already do to us. I think. I mean, Isaac, does that make sense to you? I mean, it's effectively reciprocation, right?
For a long time, until late Obama, the US policy to China was to strengthen the Communist Party. It was capacity building. It
Yep.
was, okay, we can convince Beijing to be a responsible stakeholder in the global system that was structured for US interests. And for some reason, that didn't work. And so we're still searching for a China policy. And I think we're in this pre-war period that will end when push comes to shove and there is a conflict or a war. For a long time, Chinese officials would accuse the United States of trying to contain China. And we would ignore that because we weren't trying to contain China. For the
Right.
last roughly 6 or 7 years, and arguably at the end of the Obama administration as well, became active US policy to try to contain China. And that is very much what we are trying to do. And the record on that has been mixed.
Mm.
Yep.
But on the debt issue, Tony, I mean, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't also note the intense and severe fall off in foreign direct investment that has occurred in the last 6 to 12 months. And I'm not arguing that that's not going to come back. I mean, I think you can, coerce, terrible Iranian and Russian companies to pour money in, and maybe some, persuadable South American, um, far left regimes, and even the Europeans who just can't seem to come to terms with the nature of the regime they're dealing with. I'm talking about you, Germany. So I'm not saying that it won't come back to some degree, but I do think it's an indicator that a lot of corporates have kind of gotten the joke, and if they can get out, they're getting out, or they're
Yep.
diversifying, or as Isaac said, China for China strategy. However successful or not you might think that will be.
Unless they're German, as you rightly pointed out. I
Right.
mean, every German industrial is trying to sell out to China and move their IP
Right.
to China and do other things for some really strange reason that I really can't figure out. Mary, those are great points. So we all know China wants a bigger geopolitical role. And they finally, about a year ago, dropped this silly kind of wolf warrior stance. But as we saw in the Middle East, its largest two diplomatic partners, Russia and Iran, had serious failures there, right? So I know this may seem a little bit weird, but do you think that China has peaked? We know their population has peaked, and we know their economic growth rate, or suspect their economic growth rate has peaked, and it's certainly downshifted. But do you think China has peaked in terms of geopolitical influence?
Gosh, that's a difficult question because it's not simply related to what happens inside China's borders. As you say, the way to understand China's behavior, and really we should say the Chinese Communist Party's behavior, is not through a bilateral lens. It's through this new order that has been constructed over the past 3 to 4 years, with this block of nations trying to create an alternative system to the free world system. I mean, unfortunately for the party, unfortunately for us, the partners that they've chosen have made grave strategic errors. and seen their ability to intervene and expand their power greatly curbed. You saw that just recently in Syria, where the Russians couldn't come to the aid of Assad because they're wrapped up in Ukraine, and the Iranians have been very heavily degraded by the Israelis after the Iranian-backed Hamas and Hezbollah launched attacks on Israel. So certainly they're weakened, but I don't think that we should downplay or underestimate the threat that is posed by Beijing. And this matters to financial markets because I think a lot of investors who look just at the numbers, right, think, well, goodness, if you tweak this lever or that lever, if we get this stimulus or that, everything will be fine. And if Trump can just sort of, smooth things over. But we're not talking about a normal counterparty here. We're talking about a country who, as I said, just mounted an ongoing intrusion into our major networks. Think of what's connected to our networks: critical infrastructure, our military bases, our water supply, our telecommunications network. More than 400 nukes. We have no ability to understand where they are, what the intent is for building this massive arsenal. Daily attacks on our satellites. I mean, my God, it's a long list. I mean, this is what we should be talking about, and it is linked to financial markets.
Absolutely.
Because if investors aren't thinking about, gosh, what's the stability of this system, not just the debt load, but of the person or persons who sit on top of this thing, then you're not doing your fiduciary duty. That
Correct.
has to be part of understanding what's going on.
But Mary, I think it's been easy especially for US companies, to ignore that for decades, right? I mean, investing in China or moving something to China or partnering with China has been the easy win from the perception of shareholders. And you rightly point out that leadership in companies and, of course, government have to really start questioning that easy win. Shehzad, what do you think about that? Has China peaked? And I'm not looking for a big call here, but do you believe that has China peaked, or are they close to peaking, or is momentum running out around their kind of geopolitical influence?
Yeah, economically, obviously, I think we pretty much all agree that, China has peaked, right? So, and that there are geopolitical implications of that. One of the things, which by the way, actually, I was going to mention earlier, ties into your question of, what are some of the areas of strength in China, right? So, the Chinese manufacturing sector for the last couple of years, if not more, has actually been doing pretty good. Especially if you look at their commodity side, this year they've produced more steel than anybody thought they would, more aluminum than anybody thought they would, even more copper than anybody thought they would. It's not being consumed domestically; it's being dumped abroad. So as we think about China's geopolitical, relationships and its ability to influence, well, it's actually upsetting a lot of developing countries and emerging markets who are on the receiving end of, these cheap Chinese industrial goods and manufactured products that are actually destroying their industries at home. China obviously runs these, trade surpluses with emerging market or developing countries. So I think that will inevitably have play a role and have an impact in its ability to influence these countries, even very, very close partners of China like Pakistan. You've got leaders there who will be nothing but all smiles and grateful when in front of cameras, but behind the scenes are incredibly upset with China. For things like feeling like their industries are being destroyed because of all these cheap Chinese goods that keep getting dumped in and so forth. And of course, the debt relationships are just a massive mess. So I'm not sure if China has peaked, but the relations are far more complex. And there are a lot of problems within China's relationships, I think, with these middle tier, smaller economies than this sort of very nice sounding narrative up top tells you, which is, oh, well, the Chinese don't tell us to be a democracy and the Chinese don't interfere in our system. Unlike the Americans who are constantly giving us lectures, the Chinese give us money. Well, Chinese money comes with a lot of other problems that the leaders of those countries' democracies are more than happy to talk about behind the scenes, at least. So it's not a very straightforward picture, I guess. It's not a very clean answer, but that's kind of the reality of what China's
No, it is the
relationship.
reality. It's a great point. I wrote a piece years ago called, probably 7, 8 years ago, called "The Belt and Road is Paved with Cheap Chinese Consumer Goods." And that I was really talking about East Africa at the time, but you could talk about any emerging or developing market. And I grew up in the 80s. I read a lot of Soviet stuff and saw the end of the Soviet kind of empire. And I remember reading Soviet economic, this is what I did when I was growing up, reading Soviet economic literature and talking about quotas and, like, from an American perspective, why the heck would people manage to quotas? But when I see things like the Chinese excess steel capacity and dumping on global markets, that is literally managing to quota, right? That 5% number isn't just a top level number. It is managed levels down, right? And so there is excess, there are quotas, there is dumping. And so when we look at this tariff system and the trade issues, we have to look back to the fact that China is, in fact, still a centrally planned economy. We want to consider it a capitalistic economy. It has some capitalistic characteristics, but it is very much a centrally planned economy. Mary, you spent time in the State Department,
Yes.
and I'm sure that you had to look at your negotiating frameworks and understand what the other side was thinking. So, what do you think the Chinese diplomatic corps are doing right now to prepare for a policy of reciprocation, which Trump will likely take on?
You mean besides spying on and tapping all
Oh
the
yeah, there's
phones
all that
and
status quo
reading
stuff.
all the emails of everybody? I mean, the
Exactly.
Chinese diplomatic corps doesn't do anything without instructions from Beijing.
Right.
And when they go into negotiations, they're just reading from a script. It's, if you remember the Ferris Bueller class where the students are just kind of sitting there bored to
Yep.
tears. Well, that's what it's like to sit in a meeting with a high Chinese official. It's just mind-numbingly boring because they're just reading a script. They have no independent course of action. I actually think that China's in quite a weak position right now vis-a-vis the United States. And President Trump is very serious about the tariff threat because he sees it as a tool of economic statecraft. And if Beijing were canny, I think they do what they did in the first term, which is wrap the administration up in fruitless talks for 3 years, sign a document, and then ignore it. And
Yep.
so, what I've always counseled, whether it was the secretary or other officials, and now what I do for clients, is to say, stop listening to the happy talk about the future. Look at data, look at history, look at everything that's been signed, and ask yourself, has the Chinese side adhered to anything they've signed ever? And if they haven't, which by the way they haven't, what makes you think you're so different and special that you're going to be the one that comes down from, let me see if I can get the light to come on high, and magically makes this all work? And you have to understand why they behave that way. They behave that way because it's a Marxist-Leninist regime that relies on a single individual to run the whole thing. And so that's really, who has, by the way, I think a middle school education. So that's what you're dealing with. And if you think that they're somehow focused on, boosting consumption, well, they're never going to let consumers have too much power. They don't want the Chinese citizenry to rise up and demand change and have a voice. That's not happening. So when I hear economists talking about, you really need to move to a consumer-led economy and all of this nonsense, sure, to a degree, but it's only so that they can maintain, social stability, so they don't have riots in the streets and a challenge to their control. That's really, I'm not saying that there isn't some form of, economic calculation there.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that you need to place it in a framework of the politics of the place, which is all about control and power for Xi Jinping and for the very small cadre of people around him.
Yep. And I think we only need to look at, what was it, the white paper protests of 2022 or something like that, when those Chinese authorities fear that. They really fear that, because you don't have to look too far back into Chinese history to see people rising up. And it really doesn't end well for the leadership. And the soldiers in the PLA are all from commoner backgrounds. So, you can look at uprising after uprising after uprising in China's history, and the tight fist of power that the central government has typically held gets pushed back. And that is the biggest fear of Chinese leaders. And when you see people holding white sheets of paper in December 2022 because they're tired of COVID, it's terrifying to people, because the Chinese people are saying, we can do this. And I don't think many Westerners understand that, how terrifying it is for those Chinese leaders to do that. The other thing that I don't think many Westerners understand, and I'd be curious about your views on this, but when I speak to my friends in Asia, Trump is incredibly popular, incredibly popular. Southeast Asia, China, Japan, India, incredibly popular. You don't hear this from the political classes, but he's incredibly popular among your average working day person, because they recognize that personality. They see him, they know him. Do you guys see different stuff about Trump's popularity in Asia? Any of you?
Isaac?
Well, I was going to respond to the first point about the what Xi Jinping fears, and then I'll try not to evade the Trump popularity in Asia question.
You don't have to answer it.
The with the caveat that what goes through Xi Jinping's mind is a mystery to me, and I would argue to the vast majority of the people, with the exception of 20 people at the top of the party and possibly even Xi Jinping himself. I think he's probably a lot more afraid of being stabbed in the back by one of the other members of the Politburo Standing Committee or one of the vice chairmen of the Central Military Commission, and that we have a pretty good sense of the level of political dissent in China, which is moderate, and the level of protests in China, which is low, and the threat that poses to the regime right now, which seems quite low. Again, these things can spark like they did in Tunisia and Syria, but that seems like a pretty small risk. Not to say they're not paranoid about it, but it seems like the more likely thing to overthrow Xi, if he ever gets overthrown, is some palace coup led by someone who may or may not know.
Yep.
I think in terms of Trump's popularity in Asia, so we look at this from what level of hawkishness is Trump going to be in China? And I think the most striking thing here is that Trump is probably the most dovish member of the foreign policy class in DC and the cabinet. And he is, very anti-war. He's much more isolationist. He's much more, again, America first is in ways we're focused on American domestic issues as opposed to adventuring in Asia. He is much supportive of troops in Japan, troops in South Korea, and he's much more willing to make a deal with Beijing that possibly could lose Taiwan. And I certainly hope this doesn't happen. I think it depends a lot on a lot of other domestic considerations and what Rubio and Waltz and other people in the foreign policy firmament think. But I do feel like from a Chinese leader's perspective, my guess is that in the normal course of business, they would prefer someone like Harris, who they, I think, would assume would be more pliable. But in a existential crisis or the idea of China seizing Taiwan, in my mind, Trump would be more likely to cut a deal with Beijing that wouldn't involve U.S. support of Taiwan. And again, I hope this doesn't happen, than a Harris would. And I could be entirely wrong, and I see Mary's face, and I think she might disagree with me on this. but that is my sense of the political calculus there.
Yeah, let's circumvent Taiwan for a little while because I think we could talk on that for an hour at least, and maybe we'll revisit that. But let me move more into an economically competitive U.S. So we all know about the tariffs. We've talked about that a little bit, and there's a lot more involved than just that, as you all have said. On Monday, we saw Masa from SoftBank commit to $100 billion of investment to the U.S. With tens of thousands of jobs. They said 100,000 jobs in the press conference, but let's just say tens of thousands of jobs, with Trump trying to get him to double it during the press conference, which was actually kind of funny to watch. One of my suspicions for several months has been that first, China would be more friendly than many foreign policy analysts expect right now. And also that Trump, and I say more friendly from a diplomatic perspective, similar to what Mary mentioned about, they'll agree to all sorts of things and they'll be open and that sort of thing. But will they do it is a big question. But also that Trump would focus on Chinese investment into the US in terms of FDI as a way to circumvent the tariff discussion or maybe remedy that discussion. As we saw with Masa, Trump wants investment in the US to provide jobs. So China's FDI in the US peaked in 2016 and it was nowhere near the commitment that Masa made. It was something of $14 billion. This is actually investment put in place, not announced FDI. So do you think it's possible, and Mary, I'll ask you, you can start out with this, please. Do you think it's feasible for Trump to focus on China resuming FDI in the US? Obviously, that takes a little bit of a long-term perspective, but do you think that's one of the things that he'll put in that framework with China?
Well, first, I just want to make a quick note on the prior discussion. No one should feel bad for Xi Jinping or the leadership. These are guys committing genocide in Xinjiang. I don't feel bad for them. I wouldn't feel bad. They were overthrown in a coup. Too bad. So let's just stipulate that.
Yep.
In terms of Chinese investment, we are not a communist country. We're a republic, and we have federal, state, and local officials. And so I think one of the key questions is, regardless of what the federal government does, have the political dynamics at the state level changed so dramatically over the last 8 years? Because let's recall, too, that the framework that President Trump set up was largely adopted by the Biden team by political necessity.
Yep.
Not because they didn't want to change it. I think they did want to change it. They wanted to go back to a more dovish stance, but they couldn't because of two things: because of Chinese behavior, which I think is always the most important thing to look at, and secondly, because there's now a bipartisan consensus on the federal, state, and local level that China's an adversary and that they're doing things with an unknown intent, like this massive hack. And therefore, I'm not so sure that major Chinese investment anywhere other than, say, the state of California, which is always the outlier, would be welcomed. Is Gavin Newsom going to stake his political future on welcoming a big, Chinese military contractor to invest in Silicon Valley? Well, that's insane. That's not going to happen. I mean, the House rep that reps Silicon Valley, his name is escaping me. He's on TV all the time. Very thoughtful guy. He's not going to like that. So I think the political winds have shifted because of China's behavior and because the fact of, what they're doing on trade, their corruption of international institutions, this really alarming military buildup, the huge and very disturbing incursions into our sovereign territory and our elections and all manner of things. I mean, I'm not sure that you'd find a CEO even maybe outside of those that have just long been co-opted, which would be the bulge bracket Wall Street firms, that would say, yeah, it's time to get into China. I am not talking to anybody who's saying that. I mean, other than, of course, the few that have staked their careers, their reputations, and just a ton of their capital over there. But even those who've done that haven't been treated well. I mean, look what's happened to Tim Cook and Apple, with the government saying, no, can't use Apple phones anymore. Too bad. Well, if I'm on a board or in a C-suite of a Fortune 500 company, that's alarming.
Yep, very much so. Isaac, what do you think? Do you think it's possible that Trump could push competition between, say, Japan and China to outdo each other for investment into the U.S.?
Gosh, I hope not, because Japanese investment, broadly speaking, is so much safer
Yep.
than Chinese investment. Trump met with the CEO, reportedly met with the CEO of TikTok on Monday, and it's hard to know how much of a bellwether TikTok's going to be because TikTok is such a potent election tool.
Yep.
And in this case, it's less because of Chinese influence on TikTok and because tens of millions of American voters love TikTok. And
Yep.
so if Trump is to support a ban on TikTok, that's something that has to happen very early because you have several months and then the 2026 election cycle begins again. And so I think we see action early or we see very little action at all. I think from a Chinese investment perspective, the most successful Chinese investment in the States is going to be investment that folks do not know is Chinese. And
Mhm.
often think of the example of iconic American brands like Louisville Slugger, the baseball company, and Wilson, the tennis company, which are now 100% Chinese owned. And so if Louisville Slugger announces it's building a big factory, say in Tennessee or in Missouri, unless people understand that it is a Chinese company, investment like that is going to be welcomed.
Interesting. I did not know they were Chinese owned. Thank you for that. Shahzad, do you think China will be accommodative to Trump, or do you think they'll be antagonistic? And I say this in January of 2017, and I've said this before. I was giving a briefing in Beijing to think tankers and some mid-level officials, and they didn't think that Trump would carry through on his proclamations, and they ended up being very, very wrong. Um, but it seemed like Trump and Xi had a decent relationship. So what do you expect China to do to push back on what we expect the new U.S. administration to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no reason I would think that she should try to appear to be accommodative to begin with. I think we're already seeing what they want. They want to show that they can hit back. And cowering or appearing to make a quick deal is certainly not a good look for Xi. Within his circle, it's not a good look for China internationally. So I anticipate them taking a pretty aggressive stance in retaliation. Now, the reality is that China can obviously not hit back the way we can hit them, right? There's no dollar to dollar sort of tariff thing. That just cannot happen when you run trade surpluses the way they do. But that doesn't mean that they can't hit us in ways that can still cause pain. I mean, both during COVID in 2020, then of course in 2022, when they were locked down and the rest of the world had more or less emerged out of lockdowns and such, we saw the massive amounts of supply chain disruptions that can take place, and the economic pain that causes, and the day-to-day pain that causes to American families in general. So imagine turning that into a political lever or a weapon, which they can weaponize that very, very easily.
Sure.
So I anticipate those actions. Again, it'll depend on what the tariffs look like and how hard we hit them, and the rest. But I don't anticipate trying to rush to do a quick deal and appease right off the bat.
Interesting. Okay. So let's shift gears a little bit. And I really want to talk about the China risk for US companies. Isaac, strategy risks really focuses on risks for US corporates in China. At least that's a big area of where you guys focus. So, what are the main risks that US companies are experiencing in China right now? And how has that changed over the past few years?
Thank you, Tony. So, what we always have to remind people is that by far the biggest risks that US companies and frankly any company faces in China comes from the Chinese Communist Party and is domestic risks involving competition, free trade, rule of law, access to materials, access to talent, some of it bread and butter, and some of it very dependent on the way that the Communist Party rules and the strong leftward turn that Xi Jinping has taken, especially over the last several years. And so the biggest business risks in China, and you get a Chinese entrepreneur alone, you talk to them one-on-one, they'll admit the same, comes from the Communist Party. And the most successful companies in China have succeeded despite the party and not because of the party. And we see that in the really innovative tech companies. And I think a point that's often lost in the TikTok debate is that, the founder of TikTok doesn't live in China anymore. He doesn't want to be there. And TikTok is too pro-America for Beijing. It's too pro-China for America in a lot of ways, but there's a lot of content on TikTok that Beijing finds very distasteful and libelous and treasonous because there is an allowance for a level of free speech on TikTok. The questions that we often get asked and the problems that we help companies solve, tend to focus on US political risks and geopolitical risks and sanctions risks or regulatory risks. And it's really important for companies to understand that the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is a bill that Rubio co-sponsored, is going to be a priority of him. And you think, oh, it's the State Department, it's not their job to enforce this. But Rubio is a very canny bureaucratic infighter, and he's going to work both across the aisle, but intra-department and interdepartment to make sure that companies get punished for violating that law. The other thing that companies really need to understand is that both from a domestic Chinese perspective and from an international perspective, partnering with the Communist Party is no longer the best strategy. And there's a huge number of US risks with that, which we've seen with McKinsey, we've seen with Apple, we've seen with Microsoft, and countless other firms that have relatively close relationships with the party. But it's also a big problem domestically in China. The former chairman of the Bank of China just got a suspended death sentence, the number one official at the Bank of China. And so you can imagine someone in the C-suite of a major US bank thinking in 2019, 2020, we are safe in China because we have this great relationship with the Bank of China. And it's one of the most important political institutions in China. It's a state-owned bank. It's a de facto policy bank, and it is very much in the system. But if this big US bank had a close relationship with Bank of China, right now they're in a lot of trouble in China because there is an active corruption investigation going with the links between that chairman and all sorts of entities across China and across the world. And so you don't want to get caught up in that.
Yeah. And how many defense ministers has she been through in the past 5 years? 3?
God, many, so many. And then
Please. And they're all in jail for corruption now?
their bosses.
Corruption.
Corruption. So she is chairman of the Central Military Commission, which is the body that oversees the military. And there are two vice chairmen that are above the defense minister. And the two vice chairmen who were previous, either one round or two rounds before this one died in prison. The other one is still in prison. And they rotate out a lot. And I think there's this debate about China seizing Taiwan. Is that because he doesn't believe the military is ready? But I think it's a lot less about that and more how much control does he have? And are these people who are going to do what he says? And for whatever reason, there's been conflict there and it's very destabilizing.
That's right. And it's very critical, I think, to understand that very simple fact, Isaac, is that there's a serious question as to whether or not the PLA actually stands behind Xi Jinping. Serious question. And if the PLA doesn't stand behind him, what power does he actually have? It's something that a lot of think tankers don't want to talk about, don't understand. Certainly Wall Street analysts don't understand that stuff. But how much power does he really have if the PLA, doesn't get that? And sorry, Wall Street analysts, aside from Mary Kissel, who's on this call right now, gets it.
It's Shehzad. Yeah.
Isaac, you talk about Rubio enforcing the Uyghur Labor Act on U.S. companies, but could he also do that on European companies? So, for example, there are like some European, say, sportswear companies that have a U.S. headquarters. So could he back into enforcement with European companies and really force a global Western change of behavior?
Absolutely. European companies, Malaysian companies, companies all over, and companies that have US assets or want to do business in the United States. And there are EU and UK laws in place that already restrict and ban this. And it really depends government to government on whether or not the EU will enforce that. But it is also a possibility there because the UK has a Modern Slavery Act that bans the importation of goods from Xinjiang into the UK. And the question is whether or not the UK is going to get its act together enough to enforce that. Another quick point on the PLA that people really need to understand, China does not have a military. The Communist Party has a military. The PLA is the armed wing of the Communist Party. And so there's all this talk about civil military fusion and the PLA and companies like Alibaba and Tencent. And you think, great, every SOE is part of the same organization as the PLA. And so we can also expect to see regulations that make it much more difficult for US companies to do business with the PLA, which right now, frankly, is quite easy.
Yep. Okay, let's run through a quick scenario, and I'm curious of Isaac, you start, and Mary and Shehzad, you come in. Close friend of yours comes and says, I've been selected as the China CEO for company whatever. Okay. And you're sitting down at a private lunch with them. It's an American company. I'm the China CEO for that company now. What are you saying to them?
Well, first, just to make sure this is not you, Tony.
No, no,
This
no,
is
no,
not.
no, no, no. No. I've already been warned not to go back to China. So I'm just wondering what you would say to a friend who isn't me, who will be the CEO of the China business of a major American company.
So we've had similar conversations, and it's the first thing is to make sure that their personal risk is managed. This is usually the hardest part of the conversation, but something I like to get away with first. Is your spouse Chinese? Do you have family in China? How much descent do they have? How safe are they? Because regardless of what your race is, Beijing loves to reach into family and push them there. So that's something that's very, very sensitive. You don't want to be leveraged by your family. The second piece is, on the one hand, business has risk, and going and being the CEO of a branch in another country, it's a question of, hey, were you going to be the French CEO, or were you going to go work in Nigeria or Russia or parts of Indonesia? So it's not like China is dangerous and everywhere else is safe. It really
Of
depends
course.
on the piece of that. But that said, a lot about information security, a lot about corruption and anti-corruption. There's a lot more petty corruption in China, and there's a lot less ability and desire of the courts to do something. And then also, frankly, for friends and contacts who have political ambitions, reminding them that this is no longer the path to be in good graces either with the US government or with voters. Because for a long time, you could go and you could be the CEO in China, or you could make a lot of money from China and have a flourishing political career. But unless the landscape in the US drastically shifts again, I would discourage someone from do that if they had political ambitions.
Right. So speaking Chinese at a presidential debate still isn't recommended, I guess that's what you're saying. I think what a lot of Westerners just don't understand is you land in Beijing airport or Shanghai airport or anywhere, by the time you leave that airport, the government has a complete copy of your laptop and your phone. So when I say this to people, they think, well, I don't really have anything important enough, so I'll just take my laptop. It's like, no, no, no. You need a clean laptop. You need a clean phone if you go to China. And am I wrong? I mean, I've heard that from security officials. Is that what you see as well, Isaac?
Yes, and the point that we make is you might be fine, but what about your friends who might have family in China, or the people you talk to who might have dissident leanings? And so usually you're safe, but you're putting other people in danger.
Yep, that's right. Mary, what
Well,
would you say to an aspiring executive who's the new China CEO of a US multinational?
I would echo Isaac, just from my personal experience at the State Department and knowing the number of Americans who have been arbitrarily detained and dual citizens, and it's really just not a safe place to go. And I fought kind of a low-level war with consular affairs over the threat level, because I think the U.S. government isn't leveling with the American people about the severity of the threat, and also you can't discount a surprise. I mean, what if China flies another spy balloon over Montana and Trump decides to shoot it down? Well, to Isaac's point and your point, Tony, the government has lists of all the foreigners. They could just say to the mayor of Shanghai, go round up 10 Americans right now. Doesn't matter who they are, it doesn't matter what level they are, and throw them in jail. And we've had Americans wrongfully detained in China for not just 1, 2, 3, 4 years, but like 10, 12, 15 years. So it's not safe.
Yeah.
So that's first and foremost, the issue. And as Isaac says, China isn't the only unsafe place to do business. Talk to any oil major, and they'll tell you that. I think the difference is that we haven't had successful leverage in getting our people out. So you really are taking a major risk even by setting foot on the soil. And also, Tony, when you go through the airport, they aren't just wiping your phone in their computer. They've recorded your gait. They've taken your DNA. They have pressed a button, and they have a lot of information on your family, your career, any links you might have to federal law enforcement or the US government
Yep.
or companies that they're interested in the United States. I'm not sure that Americans understand
They don't.
the capacity that they have to profile you and everyone who you know. So, yeah, I've said this in the past, and people look at me like I've got three heads and I'm some paranoid lunatic. But I promise you, I have served at a high level in government, and this is true.
Yep.
And you ought to take note of it. And then there's all the other things, of course, the attendant risks of financial risk, reputational risk, all of those things. But to me, your security is far and beyond the most important thing. And I don't counsel anybody to take a job like that.
Yep. And like both you and Isaac said, there are other very dangerous places. China is not, the most dangerous place. Maybe it is, I don't know, but there are other very dangerous places. We're not saying China is the only bad place or whatever, or even that it's necessarily objectively bad, but it's risky, right? And there are other risky places. So
I'll objectively say it's bad.
Yeah, so we're not trying to fear monger about China. We're just trying to make people aware of some of the risks, right? So Shehzad, I'm not going to ask you the same question because I know you have an ongoing business in China, but I will ask you this. You work with a lot of American companies and global companies and even Chinese companies, right? And so what are the main recommendations that you're giving to companies that you talk to? Maybe your customers, maybe not. But what are the main recommendations you're making to them for the next couple of years?
Yeah. Well, I will. If I answered the first question, my joke was going to be that I would ask my friend, "How soon are you signing the China Beige Book contract?"
That's good. Yeah.
But so actually, we don't work with any Chinese companies or asset managers. But that aside, look, the thing for China Beige Book is constantly making sure that the economic narrative that is emerging out of the government's data and the government's data as it's reproduced by the street, all the Wall Street banks, whether they're here in Europe or elsewhere, that we're constantly saying, look at what the actual private numbers are telling you about what's going on. And, our view, a few years ago, we wrote a piece, Leland Miller and Derek Sisters, our chief economist CEO, they wrote this piece, which was sort of like, let's rethink the China framework. And a big component of that is that growth is slowing down there. The economic model has changed. They're no longer looking for that, high debt, high investment, high growth model, because even if they try to do that, they're not going to get that high growth. And they understand that growth is slowing down. Would they like to turn the economy around? Yes. Are they going to succeed? It's uncertain. But you're operating in a Chinese economy that is now completely different from the last 20 to 30 years, which is essentially anybody today who would be a CEO or it would be a portfolio manager or whatever else has been trained on. That economic model is gone. Clearly, not everybody understands that, right? Which is why you keep getting these calls off. There's, this big China stimulus that is upon us, and that is going to solve all of China's problems, because neither is the Communist Party interested in doing that, nor would it solve China's problems. Even if they announced a big spending package, it's not that simple anymore. So our recommendations are tailored along those lines. But, especially with corporates, with asset managers, this is a long running thing where asset managers will try to get away with as little, I think, good China research as they can. But corporates should take this far more seriously. But oftentimes you realize that CEOs need a lot of guidance because they don't truly understand what the actual economic pictures is, because again, they're reading the same stuff that the street's putting out, which is reproducing what the government's putting out, which the newspapers and others are printing as well. So a lot of the conversation is around helping them understand what the actual data on the ground say is happening to the economy and then projecting forward on that basis.
Right. Guys, this has been a fascinating hour. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope we can revisit this sometime next year. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.